Hello, so this is Thought for the Day on Sunday the 19th of July, and the passage we're looking at is Luke chapter 7 and verses 1 to 10, and this one's for the whole church, youth, and the rest as well. It's another one of those cracking stories from the life of Jesus. And it's an amazing tale that takes place in a place called Capernaum, which was probably where Jesus moved to live at Simon Peter's house at this time. And a centurion in those days was a professional Roman soldier, a commander of about 80 troops. I know you thought it was 100. I did as well. But apparently they reckon the sort of etymology of the word centurion comes from a word that means more like tribe, and usually a centurion looked after about 80 soldiers. They were usually very brave soldiers who'd earned their rank from some act of valor. Perhaps they were the first to go through a breach in a wall during a battle, or maybe they'd fought their way single-handedly to the top of a hill before any of the other troops could get there. Centurions had to be literate because they had to read written commands, and that was no small thing in those days. They had to have connections as well. Quite often they had letters from senators and those who worked in the Senate as a way of just sort of bolstering their standing in the community. They had to be at least 30 years of age, and they had to have already served for quite a few years in the military before they could be promoted to centurion. They also had to be brilliant leaders of people. They were the sort of guys that when a battle was going badly, they had to stir the troops to get up and get going and fight again. One historian at the time wrote this. They said, a centurion in the infantry is chosen for his size, his strength, his dexterity in throwing weapons, and for his skill in the use of the sword and shield. In short, for his expertise in all matters of warfare. He is to be vigilant, temperate, active, and readier to exercise the orders he receives than to talk. He's got to be strict in exercising, and he must keep up proper discipline, especially amongst his soldiers, in obliging them to appear clean and well dressed and to have their weapons constantly ready. This is the kind of person who approached Jesus to have his servant healed by him. Think SAS, Navy SEAL, Royal Marine with a significant amount of combat experience under his belt. Tough, decisive, bold, confident, a person who could lead in the most extreme circumstances. And it just made me think, what does this say about Jesus? The confidence he inspired in people, that a man like this would approach him in the way that he did to seek his help. I can't help but feeling that this centurion saw authority, power, generosity, and a real lack of prejudice against Gentiles, which this Roman centurion was, in Jesus. He saw all these qualities. Or perhaps he just heard good reports of Jesus from his Jewish friends. Well, it sounds like his servant was very important to him. It suggests that the master-servant relationship had really developed into friendship. The centurion shows amazing respect for Jesus, knowing that as a Jew, he might not want to have much contact with a Gentile, i.e. a non-Jew. And in verse 6, notice some perhaps unexpected characteristics or qualities in the centurion. There's humility. He does not big himself up. He doesn't use the fact that he'd paid for a synagogue to be built, that somehow that should put Jesus in his debt. And recent archaeology has shown that it was quite a substantial synagogue that this man had paid for out of his own money. He would have been very much a self-made man, but there is no attitude in him towards Jesus of entitlement. You know, I've built this synagogue, therefore you should do this for me. But perhaps above all else, there is faith. He knows that he is a man with authority to give orders to soldiers who must be quick to act on them. He sees Jesus, an authority that can surely only be God's. He sees Jesus as the one who can say a simple word that can bring physical healing to someone who is even some distance away. To make things happen by a word, by a command, in a way that has no scientific explanation. It has echoes of God at creation, doesn't it? Saying, "Let there be light," and there was light. In verse 9, Jesus commends the centurion highly. Perhaps we don't quite see how upsetting Jesus' words were at that moment. I think his fellow Jews, Capernaum was massively a Jewish town by a long, long way. There were very, very few Gentiles that lived there. The centurion may have lived in a little area where there were other Gentiles, but there had been very few of them. It was a predominantly Jewish settlement. And what does Jesus go and say? Well, I think the best way we can put it is, if we put it in our own kind of context, it would be like saying this: I've seen more faith and trust in God in this fellow who has never ever even come near a church than anyone else I know who is in church every week. And the servant is healed. It made me think of something I heard someone talk about a few years ago: unbelieving believers and believing unbelievers. And unbelieving believers are those, and I think I'm in this category myself sometimes, they're those who call themselves followers of Jesus. They are Christians, but when it comes down to it, they can act as if everything was up to them to make something happen. They forget or never really expect God often to step into a situation and do something extraordinary. They don't often simply trust that when they pray, perhaps Jesus might answer it. So you often hear prayers that sort of sound like hedging their bets, really. They don't really believe God can heal or that he can turn things around that are a struggle. So they are believers, followers of Jesus on one level, but will rarely step out in faith. Faith perhaps spelt R-I-S-K. Or they might never pray for something that they would deem impossible to happen unless God stepped in. Refusing to step out of their comfort zone in terms of faith, perhaps for fear that God will let them down. Unbelieving believers. And then there are believing unbelievers, and I think the centurion comes into this category. Those are the people that might say, yeah, I'm not really sure what I believe about God, Eric. No, I never go to church. But if you meet them in the street or at the neighbourhood centre or on a bus and offer to pray for them, they will often say, in fact always say, it's been my experience, yeah, okay. Then they even seem to expect something might happen as you pray. And often with these believing unbelievers, it does. They seem quicker and more willing to be prayed for than some Christians I know. Maybe they just have less baggage about it all. And I've lost count of the number of times I've prayed for people in this community, on the phone even, in the street, on a bus, in Townsend House, outside the vicarage, usually with a hedge trimmer in one hand and wearing my gardening togs, whatever, and they have encountered something of the peace, the love and the healing of God. People have no connection with church, saying, oh, what's that? I'm starting to feel really peaceful. Or on one occasion, I feel really loved. Is that God? Or they don't say anything. You ask them, are you all right? And they say, yeah, no, keep praying. I feel great. Is this God? Or tears come and they say, no, it's okay. These are good tears, Eric. the centurion, I think, was one of those believing unbelievers. He wasn't a believer by any of the standards of the faithful of his time. He certainly was not seen as no matter how many synagogues he'd built, he was a Gentile, a non-Jew. And as much as his Jewish friends might have really appreciated his kindness to him, he was still an outsider to those who considered themselves believers at that time. Well, may we all become, whether we're unbelieving believers or believing unbelievers or something else, may we all become believing believers. I've said before, anybody who's a regular at St Mary's will have heard me say this before, but when I get to heaven, there's a number of people I want to have a coffee with. At whatever franchise has got heaven covered, whether it's Costa or Nero's, it's probably Starbucks. They've got the best Wi-Fi in Headington. Come back soon, Starbucks. The usual people that I would want to see and have a coffee with in heaven. Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela, Mrs. Gretton. You won't have heard of Mrs. Gretton, that's my old Sunday school teacher. But also this nameless centurion. I want to know what happened after this story. I hope he not only received healing for his beloved servant, but I also suspect and hope he found healing for his own heart and soul from Jesus as well. Jesus still has power to heal. Can we become people like this centurion who can simply step out in faith to trust in an uncomplicated way and just ask God for the things that we need?